Let me start by saying I love every Lee Enfield I own. Lee Enfields are super cool, and as far as Marshall bolt actions go, they are one of the best. Now, I say that because every time I do a video like this, people comment about how wrong I am because I said their Milsurp has some issues that need to be worked out if they're really going to say it's the best ever and has no drawbacks. So, that being said, I did a video a while back talking about how Lee Enfields are the best military bolt action, and in this video we're going to talk about is 7 issues with the Lee Enfields that make them not as great as everyone says they are. The first one is Lee Enfields have a very exposed action. As opposed to other rifles like Mausers and Mosin-Nagants and some others, this action is just out in the open for everyone to see. When I open this, you can see that the bolt does not really go into the receiver, it just stays right on the outside. And that is because they have rear locking lugs, which are right here, and then under it in the back, right here. Now, a flaw with that design is that dirt and debris can get in there very, very easily and cause issues that make it gum up. I've had issues with my SMLEs, particularly number 1 Mark IIIs. I think it was the one that's behind me, not actually this one. But I was out at the range and I dropped my bolt. I took it out because I was going to work on the front sight. And since my hands were going to be close to the muzzle, I just wanted to make sure there was no possibility of it going off. So I took the bolt out, and while I did that, I dropped it in the sand. So when I tried to put it back in the rifle and close it up, I couldn't, because there was just one little piece of sand that was under it on that rail that runs alongside the rifle. These actions are just a lot more susceptible to grime and debris than other rifles are. Whereas with Mausers in particular, I've done this test where I just had a bunch of sand inside of my 24-47 and it still worked flawlessly. Those rifles are just much more sealed off from the elements, and if debris does get into them, it causes much less of an issue than it does on Lee Enfield rifles. The second thing I would like to point out is that Lee Enfields have a different manual of arms. Now, in my last video, I said this was something that was a positive. It's both a positive and a negative, and it is that Lee Enfields are very unique. They are cock on close instead of cock on open. So, it's pretty frequent that I hand a Lee Enfield to somebody, and they have experience with bolt actions, and when they go, they push it forward as far as it'll go, and then they push their hand down. And nothing happens, because Lee Enfields are a cock on close. So what that means is, if I turn this around, you push it forward, it's not going to close unless you push it further forward, and then it finally closes. It hangs up there. Now, this is something I think is really cool about this rifle, and I think it is actually a positive, but it is something that just causes a lot of weird things for people, and I've just had experience with people not quite sure how to deal with it in the past, whereas with stuff like Mausers and Mosin-Nagants, which are cock on open, they just feel a lot more natural, and there's less training that needs to go into running it well. The way that cock on open works is as I lift the bolt up, you'll see the cocking piece in the back goes up. And then when I push it forward, it just goes down. Now, this Mosin is just a little bit stiff, but you get the idea. The third thing that I would like to talk about is that Lee Enfields have very expensive ammunition. By far, the most common round for Lee Enfields is .303 British. .303 is an expensive round. At the cheapest I've been able to find it right now, I've seen it for $30 for a box of 20, so $1.50 a round. Whereas I've seen 8mm Mauser fluctuating anywhere from 30 cents a round to 70 cents a round, even occasionally in this wacky market that we have right now. Now, this ammunition for Lee Enfields is just very expensive. But here's the thing, there are some ways to get around that. So I have an Ishapur 2A1, because I like to actually be able to shoot the rifles that I own, and this rifle is in 7.62 NATO instead of .303 British. So because of that, I can buy ammo off the shelf in most stores, and I can shoot it much cheaper. Now, the other thing is with some military bolt-action rifles, you can find the one rifle in a number of different calibers. You can find Mausers, and I know Mauser is a very general term. We can talk about that another time. In fact, we have talked about that another time. But Mausers come in a variety of different calibers, and so if you want to just collect Mausers, you can have a ton of different calibers with a lot of different capabilities as well. However, with Lee Enfields, as far as I know, you really only have 2 options. That's .303 British and 7.62 NATO, which is like .308. So you just have far less options for calibers, and the most common type of Lee Enfield, the ammunition is very, very expensive for it. The fourth thing I'd like to talk about is issues with Headspace. Head spacing issues are much more common on Lee Enfields in my experience than they are with other rifles. Now, what headspace is basically what holds the round where it's supposed to be when it's inside of the chamber. On rimless rounds like this 8mm Mauser, the headspace is done from the back of the case to the neck, which is right here. And that just basically holds the round right up against the bolt face. We'll talk about why in just a second. On rimmed rounds like this 7.62x54R, it just headspaces on the rim, which is right here. So it headspaces from this space right here on the front of the rim to the back of the rim up against the bolt face. Now, why is headspace important? Well, it's for two reasons. If headspace is too tight, some rounds can just have a hard time seating, and some rounds can get stuck in the chamber. It shouldn't necessarily be dangerous per se, but it can just cause some problems. But the problem with Lee Enfields is oftentimes excessive headspace. The reason why that problem is caused is because there is just such a long distance between the front of the bolt face and to the back of the locking surface right here in the rifle. Now, with excessive headspace, what can happen is that the round can get separated from the bolt face when you fire it, and it is the difference between me pressing my hand like this, it's a stable pressure, versus punching it. So if the round gets separated by even just a little bit, and then when you fire it punches that bolt every time, that can cause some pretty major issues, including the headspace getting larger over time, and if it gets to this point, the rifle can blow up. Now, hopefully none of that happens, and it doesn't often get to that extreme, but headspace can cause a large number of issues, and Lee Enfields are more prone to headspacing issues than some other rifles. Now, let's talk about handling. Almost all Lee Enfields are very, very long, and the short ones are pretty difficult to come by, which are the number 5, what's often called the jungle carbines. So these are long and heavy rifles. They weigh about 9 pounds. Now, that's about the same as a Kar 98K, about the same as a Mauser 9130, but with Lee Enfields, this is about the shortest you'll generally find, with the exception of those number 5s, which are pretty rare. So, because they're pretty long rifles, they are just difficult to handle and a lot to deal with. Now, it also means you get a long sight radius, even with the sights being pretty far forward on the number 1 Mark IIIs, but it just is a positive and a negative. Also, this full-length stock just also means that it's going to weigh a little bit more than rifles that don't have a full-length stock all the way up to the muzzle. Basically, they're big and awkward. Now, like I already said, Mauser 9130s and a lot of Mausers also have that long issue, but many rifles are made shorter. So, for example, I have this Mauser M44. This is a carbine-length version, and you can find like M38s that don't have the bayonet. The weight thing isn't as much of an issue here because this bayonet gives it quite a bit of extra weight. These are still pretty heavy rifles. But they are shorter, and that weight is just tucked closer to your body, which does make it feel a little bit lighter. Another example, and I'm going to get some serious hate in the comments for suggesting that the Carcano has any advantage over the Lee Enfield. Lee Enfield guys get really, really salty. But another example is this Carcano. This is a really short little carbine, and it's really light and handy. I actually quite like Carcanos. I just think they're cool, even if they're not necessarily the greatest bolt-action rifle that's ever been made. So all of that being said, this rifle does have an advantage over the Lee Enfield, and it's that it's short and easier to deal with in small spaces, and just easier to carry and lighter. All right, 2 last things, and both of them are like 2 parts. The Lee Enfield is difficult to disassemble. The Mauser, the Mauser, the Carcano, a number of other rifles can be disassembled without any tools. The Lee Enfield, you need a very specialized tool to disassemble. In fact, one of the first videos that I made on this channel was about how to make a Lee Enfield disassembly tool. Let me grab it. This is my Lee Enfield bolt disassembly tool, and the way that works is after you pull the bolt head off of the bolt, and after you undo the set screw right here that holds the firing pin in, you put the bolt disassembly tool in here and then twist it. Now, you might need to put something in there to get a little bit more leverage, but this is basically what that tool does. So you need a very specific tool to disassemble the bolt on the Lee Enfield, but that's not all that I'm talking about. Now, in case some angry middle-aged British dudes already haven't started writing in the comments, the Lee Enfield has a disassembly that is somewhat similar to Kel-Tec, What I mean by that is it is covered in screws. You need to take off a whole lot of different screws in order to take the stock out of the rifle. This rifle is just covered in screws that you need to take off in order to take it apart. It's just a lot more work than other rifles. And even then, that's not necessarily all I'm talking about, because to get the stock off, you also need to get just the stock off. That's just the fore-end wood, but the stock, you need a long screwdriver to put in here and to undo, since it does have a split stock right here where the receiver is. Now, that also gives it some advantages, because they just manufacturing-wise didn't need to find one very, very long piece of wood. They could use 2 separate pieces of wood. That's not what we're talking about in this video, though. So there's just one other issue with this rifle, is it has a complicated disassembly. A lot of screws to undo, and if you are a collector in the modern day, not necessarily fighting in a war, you don't want to mar those screws as you're taking them apart. It can just be a lot of extra work. Now, the last thing to talk about is parts interchangeability. There are some serious differences between the No. 1 Mark III, the Ishapur 2A1, and the No. 4 Mark I. Now, the Ishapur 2A1, which is the Indian one in 7.62 NATO, and the No. 1 Mark III do have a lot of parts commonality, but there are some parts that are different. And the No. 4 Mark I has a lot of parts that are different. In fact, the bolt is almost just a different design. Now, that's not necessarily an incredibly bad thing. It just means that if you want to find parts, it is more of a process than it is for something like a Mauser Nagant, which has a lot of parts similarities. You could take the bolt out of any Mauser Nagant and put it in a new Mauser Nagant, and as long as the headspace is within a decent margin, you're perfectly fine. You're not going to run into any issues. In fact, triggers are the same. Just about everything from this point on the rifle to this point on the rifle is completely interchangeable. Lee Enfields just have a lot less parts interchangeability, and I do think that that is an issue worth noting when we're talking about this in a collector's sense and not necessarily a military sense. Now, I should clarify, I did not modify any non-broken parts on this rifle, but I did get a sporter stock for it, and then I cut down a barrel that was already bulged and then reattached the front sight. Now, when it comes to the stock, I believe this is a sporterized Lithgow stock set that I bought. I can't remember, I did check at one point. But it is dated 1942, which is pretty cool. Now, I bought this and it was already sporterized, but I did still need to file away just at a few places on the wood just to make it fit this Ishapur 2A1 receiver. The point is, Mauser Nagants and some other rifles are just very simply copied and pasted, but shorter. Copied and pasted, but with better sights. Those types of things. Lee Enfields went through just different iterations that had different changes, and because of that, not all of the parts are interchangeable. Now, to you, that might not matter depending on your context, but for me, as a collector, it just makes it more challenging when I'm trying to find a part that broke. Now, if you made it this far in the video, leave a comment that says, "It's Tuesday, isn't it?" and make all of the middle-aged British dudes even just a little bit more angry. Now, I angered a bunch of middle-aged British dudes, but I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
John.